And we're live, but not live, since we're just giving a little bit of count up here. What's happening, IDP faithful? And thanks for joining us. And we march on here, so let's do this. What should your lineup setting strategy be in the playoffs? That and more this week on the IDP Roundtable. Guru, give us the wisdom. It's time to set our lineups for the playoffs. We have too much time to think about it. So what should we be doing when it is time to set our lineups?
Yeah, and we run into this about every year. We talk about the same thing every year. Think long, think wrong, whatever cliche you want to throw out there. You've got too much time to study. You talk yourself out of starting guys. I'm a firm believer in you dance with the date you brought to that got you there. So, when it comes to picking your players, I'll look at matchups. If I've got something that's absolutely a horrendous matchup or something like that, I might make a change. But if guys are close, I try to pick my starting lineup, figure out who my starters are, and stick with those guys, especially late in the season and into the playoffs. There's so many things that change when we get to this point in the season. You've got teams that maybe don't have anything to play for, guys that are starting to play younger players. Especially this year with all the COVID and everything else, there's a lot of shuffling around there. Just don't overthink your situation. If you've got a guy that's been consistent, been putting up 4 points for you, and he's got a decent matchup, don't try to play the guy with the better matchup over top of him, because 9 out of 10 times it's going to turn around and bite you in the butt. Stick with the guy that got you there.
Yes, I think that absolutely think long, think wrong. Don't talk yourself into matchup-based plays. Matt, feel free to add anything you want on that particular point. But we had a question from Joe Conti, Master Poe, on Twitter. And he wants to know if there's any positive, negative correlation or anything that you should consider when you set your lineups about starting 2 players from the same defense. He brought up examples like Isaiah Simmons and Budda Baker, or Leonard Williams and Blake Martinez. So lineup setting, thoughts, philosophy, and then any thoughts on this idea of whether it should matter if you already have players in your lineup from that defense.
I think it kind of, I agree with what you guys said already about the lineup strategy. So I think for playing a couple of teammates, I think it really, like offense, it depends on the team we're talking about. I'd feel fine about starting Devontae Adams and Robert Tonyan together, for example, but I'm not starting Dallas Goedert and an Eagles receiver in the same lineup. So, if we do have Blake Martinez, Leonard Williams, I think those are a couple of guys that are fine to put together in a lineup. I would try not to play 2 linebackers from a team that's not in line to get a bunch of tackles in that game. So if you have to decide between Deion Jones and Foye Oluokun, a lot of times I would try not to play both of those guys. Those are 2 players that could play together in plenty of weeks. But, Devondre Campbell and Jordan Hicks might be a good example this week. I would go ahead and start Jordan Hicks and not start Devondre Campbell, and maybe we'll talk about those guys again. So I guess it really depends on the situation. I think in most cases, I would lean away from starting the 2 teammates if it's a close call, but I would not I would not reach for another player just to avoid playing 2 teammates.
Yeah, I like the idea of thinking about how the players, the roles overlap or don't, seeing if it's capping the upside of your lineup by playing both of them. You can think about that on the offensive side too. Let's talk some linebackers, John. Corey Littleton, the last time we talked about Corey Littleton, we were kind of dismissive and ready to move on from him. Is there a reason to turn around and look back?
Yeah, maybe some hope for next year. So here's what's going on with the Raiders. Josh Morrow's dealing with a concussion. They play the early game this week on Thursday night, so chances are he's not going to get cleared. That's going to put Littleton back in probably an every down role, which he hasn't been in since he was injured 4 weeks ago or whatever it was. The firing of Paul Gunther as a defensive coordinator isn't really going to have a whole lot of impact for the rest of this season. It's just too late for them to really change a whole lot. They will kind of continue with what they've been doing. The only difference there may be how they call the game and what defenses they call in certain situations and so forth. But that's really not going to have much of an effect on Littleton. If you've got, especially in dynasty leagues, if you've got Littleton on your roster, last time we talked about him, I was ready to cut bait and move on, which I did in a couple of leagues. At this point, with Gunther being fired and so forth, we don't know who the defensive coordinator is going to be for next year. We don't know how much the situation is going to change. So now I'm kind of changing gears a little bit, and I'm a little more inclined to set on him at least for next season and see what happens there, see if there's any difference in development as far as, that they wind up going to a 3-4 and he winds up playing as an inside linebacker. I mean, it's hard to say where they're going to go there. But something is definitely going to change. Whether or not that actually boosts his value up, I look back at how good he was while he was with the Rams. I've alluded to it several times this year that a lot of that, I think, was the situation that he was in there and the scheme that he was in there. But who's to say he doesn't wind up in a similar scheme with whoever takes over as a defensive coordinator next year? We know the guy's capable. He's put up big numbers for us in the past. So, no, I'm not going to start sticking him in my lineup in the playoff game and hope that something changes. But I am probably going to try to hang on to him in most of my dynasty situations until I see how that goes down next year.
Yeah, and real quick on those Raiders for Thursday night, they did rule out Nick Morrow with his concussion. They did rule out Clelin Ferrell. They did rule out Damon Arnett, and they ruled out Jonathan Abrams. So a lot of guys, and at least 3 guys that we consider for lineups lately, are not going to be involved in that game.
Matt, it's good news for the Chargers offense, and maybe for that becoming a high-scoring game when you're setting lineups. Think about that, the blow potential there. Let's stick with linebackers and some injury notes, Matt. Injury notes on Darius Leonard, Fred Warner, the 2 best linebackers in the league, maybe. And Devondre Campbell, you mentioned it, you alluded to it. What do we need to know about these injuries, or at least what should we be monitoring as it gets closer to time to set our lineups?
Yeah, and by the way, I think a lot of us could use some good news for that Chargers offense after the past couple of weeks.
Oh, yeah.
But the linebacker injuries, so lots of practice participation reports to watch this week as we're seeing who's going to be ready for our lineup and who might not be. Darius Leonard had a back injury, left last week's game early, I think in the 4th quarter it was, but Frank Reich said that it's not a serious issue. So it doesn't sound like Darius Leonard's in danger of missing. Obviously, we'll have to watch his practice week and see how he turns up for the game. But I think Darius Leonard's going to be available for us. Thank goodness. Fred Warner, the last I saw today is that the 49ers don't know yet about his availability. He had a shoulder/neck injury, the thing that's often called a stinger, did at least test negative for a concussion. So it doesn't have to pass through the concussion protocol. But we're going to have to see how he progresses with the neck shoulder thing and see if Fred Warner is available for them this weekend and for our IDP lineups. The Cardinals, Devondre Campbell played through a questionable tag last week. Isaiah Simmons played through a questionable tag last week. Devondre Campbell did so after practicing none of the days leading up to the game. So he looked like an iffy play. And then in the game, he did start and only played 45% of the snaps. Isaiah Simmons played the other 55%. So if it's going to be anything along those lines again, that means we can't use either guy. So we'll see if Campbell practices more this week, see if maybe he's in line for more snaps. I would sure try to use neither of them because I would think that the Cardinals would like to get Isaiah Simmons more playing time anyway. Devondre Campbell's a short-term contract guy, so I don't think he's a long-term future player for them. We'll see. Again, I'll try to avoid that situation altogether. We got some guys at other positions, but I don't know if you want to save those for other parts of the show too.
Go ahead. While we're on the injury beat, go ahead and run down the rest of the injury beat for us, because this is a week where we have to take everything down to splitting hairs when it comes to time to set lineups.
That's right. Carlos Dunlap has a foot injury that kept him out last week. It should have kept him out the week before because he barely played, did nothing for us. So we're going to have to watch him this week. I would try not to use Carlos Dunlap, at least unless he's back to full practice by the end of the week. Jonathan Allen for Washington, he has a groin injury that we'll have to watch. And more interesting than usual, I think, because he's playing Seattle, which has tied for the 3rd most sacks allowed in the league. Josh Jones, a safety for the Jaguars, left last week's game early with a shoulder injury. Andrew Wingard finished out that game for him, so we're going to have to see if Josh Jones is ready to play this week. If he is, I think he's a starter. If he's not sure I'm using Andrew Wingard in the same regard in lineups because Josh Jones is a better bet for all those in-the-box tackles against Baltimore. Cowboys secondary is supposed to get several guys back this week. Trevon Diggs, who's been on IR. Donovan Wilson, who's missed the past couple games with a groin injury. Chidobe Awuzie is expected back. I believe he was on the COVID list. Mike McCarthy said he's expecting all those guys back. We're going to have to watch. I haven't checked the Wednesday practice report yet to see if any of those guys practiced, but watch them through the week and see if we can use any of them. Denzel Ward, the Browns are hoping that he's back for that game, so we'll have to watch him, make sure he's good to go. And then Quentin Dunbar, in true Pete Carroll fashion, the update is that he's going to practice this week with the mentality of playing in their game against Washington this week. And then we'll see if Dunbar is ready to come off IR from that knee injury. If he is, I'm playing Quentin Dunbar against Washington, not too high, but he'd probably be like DB 25 level play for me in what could be a revenge game for him against his former team.
Yeah, Pete Carroll, positivity. Petey Sunshine, not always very useful. And on Wingard, on the note on Wingard, I just want to point this out because in the IDP show, we always get some tips just based on our IDP knowledge. I saw him turning and chasing after Derrick Henry a few times last week. So maybe J.K. Dobbins, Gus Edwards, if Wingard's back there, not the best last line of defense. All right, I don't know if everybody saw this. Vince Williams, he went on the COVID list last week, and he said that it's like smoking. He feels like he smoked 8 packs of Newports, 3 Black and Milds, and a Russian cream. So that's one of the more vivid descriptions we've gotten of COVID and how it feels. Let's take the IDP spin on this, John. Last week, well, just because of attrition, we had some clarity on the Pittsburgh inside linebacker situation. What do we think about it this week?
Yeah, we got some clarity by default because Williams landed on the COVID list a couple of days before the game, or it might have even been Saturday. But either way, by default, we saw Avery Williamson play virtually every down. He was like 86% or something like that, close enough to every snap to go 9 tackles and 2 assists in the game. Unfortunately, that didn't really give us much clarity about what's going to happen going forward with these two guys. If you count the days, I don't know if either of you have seen whether Williams actually had COVID or was a contact situation that put him on the list. But if he actually had COVID, tested positive, then he's not going to be available again this week. If he is on the watch list, then he may get cleared in time to get into the game. So we're going to have to watch that as we go through the course of the week. But either way, they match up with the Bengals this week. I've got it in my notes as a bah humbug matchup as we lead up to Christmas here, because the Cincinnati offense is just stagnant. The running game is not doing much. They're just not providing much opportunity for opponents to have tackle production. If you're playing guys that are going to make sacks and big plays, and you're going to bank on that, then you might put those guys in there. But if I had to pick one of these guys to put in my lineup this week, it would definitely be Williamson, because I think he's the more safe play. Even if both of them are active, we know they're both going to get on the field and both going to have some opportunity in the game. I don't really have grand expectations for either of them to put up more than 5 tackles. If Williams gets in the game, he has a shot at getting a sack against a team with the second most sacks allowed in the league. But the ceiling is limited. So you're going to have to kind of take a look at what you've got to work with and pick your poison there.
Let's talk about defensive line, particularly Matt. And like John said at the top of the show, think long, think wrong. Maybe at first glance, Emmanuel Ogbah is a player that you're going to be perplexed by and think about too much, and therefore you shouldn't play him. Is there a way to make the decision on Ogbah simpler this week?
Yeah, I mean, it's important for these guys to look at the production behind the sacks and the tackles, because Ogbah looks like he's been letting you down lately. 4 games now without a sack, but over the past 3 weeks, he's had 5, 9, and 3 total pressures, according to Pro Football Focus. He's had 5 and 1 QB hits the past 2 games. So he's been producing. It's not that he's not playing well. He just hasn't gotten home for sacks. And I forget who they're playing this week, which I'm trying to look up clandestinely now.
New England.
Yeah, there you go.
Cam Newton.
Yeah,
Sit and duck.
Exactly. The matchup is better for him this week. So I would go back to Ogbah or stick with him if you've been sticking with him through the cold snap so far, because the production's been there behind the lack of sacks. And I mean, also on the Avery Williamson question, I would stick with him as well. He has played now 7 games for either the Jets or the Steelers in which he has seen at least 50% of the snaps, and he has made at least 8 tackles in every one of those games, averaging 10 total tackles in those games.
All right, let's stay with defensive line. Let's take a question from the chat room. It's week 15. It's important. We want to be there for you. Ice Raider 123, John. Frank Clark goes to face Taysom Hill down here in New Orleans. Not exactly showing the best pocket awareness and ball security lately. Or Olivier Vernon, who gets, I don't know, a hobbled Daniel Jones or Colt McCoy Giants offense, again, they're just like clinging to a piece of driftwood to keep from drowning right now. It's kind of an attractive choice. Who do you like better between Clark and Vernon?
So I guess here it comes down to just how lucky do you feel. I think Vernon's probably got the most upside. We've talked about it a few times in the past about his inconsistency. I actually had him on my list of guys to talk about here a little bit later in the start bench area, but I'll go ahead and hit that now. The guy has 7 sacks in the last 6 games, but they've all come in 3 of those 6 games. The other 3 games, he's done virtually nothing. Matchup-wise, I think is favorable this week. We know he's going to get the snaps. Like Matt says, you look at the pressures and all that. Vernon is getting the opportunity. He's getting the pressures even when he's not getting to the quarterback. I am just, at this point, a little disappointed with what Frank Clark has done. Yes, they are allowing more sacks now that Drew Brees is not in the game because you don't have that quick release, and you've got Taysom Hill moving around a little bit more, trying to make things happen than what Brees would, where he would just go back and uncork it if anybody even got the same zip code as he was. But I think in this situation, I'm probably, especially if I'm an underdog, I'm going to roll with Olivier Vernon. This is not one of those cut and dry where if you've been starting one guy all year, you go with that. In some situations, you kind of have to split hairs a little bit and make that decision. But I think in my lineup this week, I'd probably roll the dice with Vernon.
Yeah, that's where I'm going to go. You can give us a third vote on that one, Matt. And then also, I could have used some advice on this last week, and actually were kind enough to give me some advice to not play Justin Houston last week. I should have had Dalton Smith in there. But what about this week? Because it was the Houston game that he went off in 2 weeks ago, which made me pause and think, is it just foolish to put him on the bench coming off a performance like that? Is it foolish to bench him? Is it foolish to put him in there this week? So that Vernon Clark question, give us your vote, and then tell us about Justin Houston.
I'm definitely firmly on the Olivier Vernon side of that. I think Frank Clark is only even an option because of the matchup with Taysom Hill, which has made the Saints more sackable. And we don't even know for sure yet if Drew Brees might play in that game. I think if he does, then it's easy. But I'm going Olivier Vernon either way. He's got the matchup with the Giants. Both of the guys are boom busts. Vernon has actually boomed at times this year. Frank Clark has just had weeks where he didn't bust. Justin Houston, I think he's in play because he had that big game against Houston, but the issue with him is playing time, because right after he had that 3-sack game against Houston, he dropped back down to 41% playing time this past week, and that's a season low. His second lowest was the week before that Houston game. So I don't know exactly what it was about the Texans game that made it his spot and he's suddenly shown, but he's done a lot more disappointing than he has producing this year. So I'm leaning away from Justin Houston this week. It depends certainly on who you're comparing him to, but I don't think this is somebody to try too hard to get into your lineup.
All right, let's move on here. Talk a little bit more about this week's lineup decisions before we look long-term future and then get to the starts and sits. Saturday, so folks, you got to know 2 games on Saturday. The Thursday game, Chargers-Raiders. Saturday, we're going to get Denver and Buffalo, and we're going to get Green Bay and Carolina. What that means, John, is you're going to have to make a decision about your Green Bay linebackers, all your Green Bay players, before Sunday. In this case, we're looking at the Green Bay linebackers. What guidance can you give us as they face Carolina this week?
No, the first thing I'm going to do is ask both of you, have you seen anything that suggested Christian Kirksey might have been injured in this last game? Anybody seen anything that explains why he only played 68% of the snaps? Okay, so I'm not alone there. I did some searching today, and I was not able to come up with anything. So I'm assuming that was a coach's decision. But the fact of the matter is Kirksey was limited to 68% of the snaps. Chris Barnes played 59% of the snaps. Obviously, that means that there were a few plays that they were on the field together. But the majority of the time was spent in a timeshare. Kirksey really hasn't done much since he returned to the lineup from his injury. I believe he's put up 4 or fewer solo tackles in most of the games. I'm not even sure if he's gotten over 4 solo tackles, maybe once or twice, but he's definitely not been the player that we expected earlier in the season. So you're at a critical point in the season. You can't really afford to make a mistake. I can't afford to put somebody in my lineup that I'm not sure is going to at least play 70 or 80% of the snaps. And at this point, I don't really know what's going on in Green Bay. So I would definitely keep an eye out for some kind of information later in the week, see if we can find something that explains what's going on there, and then make a decision based off of that information. But as it stands right now on Wednesday night, I don't have enough confidence to put either of these guys in my lineup for a playoff game.
Let's stay with the Saturday linebacker uncertainty tip, Matt. Buffalo and Matt Milano, which could affect Noah Fant's ability to score this week. What about his ability to score from the linebacker position, or A.J. Klein's ability to score against Denver?
Yeah, based on what we've seen the past 2 weeks, I can't start Matt Milano or A.J. Klein in this game. Milano did increase his playing time over his return game, but he still stopped short of 50% snaps in that game last weekend against Pittsburgh. So I don't know. That suggests to me that he's not all the way back. He was not on the injury report at all last week for the first time since something like week 4. So it doesn't seem like it was a physical limitation. I don't know if they're still ramping him back up after even an extended stint on temporary IR. So I'm waiting to see if there's any report on Milano heading into Saturday's game. But unless I see something that's telling me he's going to play a full-time role, I don't feel comfy going back to Milano full-time. I would imagine the A.J. Klein has done enough that they're going to keep him on the field a little bit more than they were early in the season. But his playing time is back down with Milano's ramping up. He was down to 52% of the snaps last week. So, I mean, on that, A.J. Klein has to get home for 2 sacks to be a good play at that level of playing time. So I'm not using him either. I think there's the chance that we even get more Milano this week than A.J. Klein for this game.
Okay, let's look to the future. Let's have a little content here for folks who might not be setting lineups for playoffs, or at least not setting as many lineups as they hoped. John, let's talk some Dynasty Stash linebackers, as I just did in the league that John runs, the Red Eye Masters. Sweep the deck. We don't need cornerbacks and so on anymore. We can start looking to the future.
Yes, a lot of us have reached that time of the season where we're knocked out, and it's time to start shedding some of those guys that we were holding as backups for our playoffs and look towards the future. So there's some roster space out there available. Last week I talked about a few defensive linemen that you might want to stash. This week I've got a list of linebackers that might be stashable guys. Some of them in a lot of dynasty leagues are already going to be stuck on taxi squads, so hopefully I'll throw somebody out here that might be available for you. I'll start off with Malik Harrison in Baltimore. Guy was a killer player for Ohio State. Great job, run defender. We've seen him play a significant number of snaps in a few games this year, and it seems like every time he gets on the field for close to 50% or more than 50% of the snaps, he puts up good numbers. It's kind of a crowded situation there, so it's hard to say what's going to happen next year. But they do have a couple guys that have been getting playing time that are at the end of their contract at the end of this season. So Harrison has an opportunity to possibly move up there. Logan Wilson for the Bengals. I've talked about him several times, especially early in the season. We finally quit talking about him because nothing was really changing there. He only played 8 snaps this last game, which doesn't really bode well for anything, but that's kind of the season's a wash anyway. What we need to look at there is that Josh Bynes is a free agent at the end of the year, and I strongly believe that Logan Wilson was drafted to eventually take over as the starting inside linebacker, starting middle linebacker there. So, again, he's a guy that a lot of dynasty managers were pretty high on. So he's probably stashed on a taxi squad in a lot of leagues, but if you happen to be in a situation where you can pick him up, get him on your roster. Jermaine Carter, excuse me, has replaced Tahir Whitehead at middle linebacker in recent weeks. It's been very quiet. He hasn't really put up big numbers, but he is getting upwards of, over 70% of the snap in the last 2 games. I think he has 8 tackles and 5 assists over those 2 games. So the numbers aren't really eye-catching where anybody's going to notice, but this is a guy that was a 5th-round pick a couple years ago. Came into the league without grand expectations, was kind of a developmental player, but he has looked pretty good on the field when he's had an opportunity to play. So, again, depending on how deep your league is, might be somebody we're sticking on a taxi squad or stashing for next year. Robert Spillane is a guy that we've talked about a lot. He played much better than expected when he got on the field, and I put him on the list because I could foresee him possibly being the starter next to Devin Bush next year instead of Avery Williamson or Williams. So Spillane, solid pass defender, played good against the run. I think he's just a better all-around linebacker than what Vince Williams is. I'm not sure what the contract situation is with Avery Williamson, if he has a potential to be there beyond this year, if his contract is up. But Spillane, I think, turned a lot of heads and impressed a lot of people. So I could see him sliding into that backup role, that second linebacker role on the inside. Tay Crowder of the Giants, rookie 5th-round pick, had 6 tackles, an assist, and a sack on 39 snaps in Week 13. His second game back from injury. The game before he was injured, he had 6 tackles, 4 assists, and a fumble recovery back in Week 6. He's been moving up the playing time charts at the inside linebacker position. I think he's a guy that I haven't really seen him do anything that's impressive in coverage, so I don't know that he'll be able to develop into a 3-down type guy there. But the playing time has been positive. His production with that playing time has been pretty good. He could be a guy that sneaks into a starting role come next year. Drew Tranquil for the Chargers. The Chargers mess just keeps biting us week after week for anybody that tries to figure out what's going on there. But I said at the beginning of this season that I thought Tranquil had a good shot at being their 3-down linebacker, where Kazir White has been seeing a lot of time. He's a transplanted safety, so he's got good cover skills. He's got good speed. He's slightly undersized, but he fits into the mold what they look for there at the weak side linebacker position, and he was in line to start at that position this year until he got hurt in Week 1. Blake Cashman, again, for the Jets. I was higher on him earlier in the season. I still got him on my radar, but the guy's just having too much trouble staying healthy this year. If he comes out next year and is healthy, I think the Jets at one point were counting on him to be their starter next to C.J. Mosley. I think Neville Hewitt has continued to improve in the lineup for the last 2 years now, to where he has a pretty good shot at hanging on to that job. But Cashman is a guy that might be worth sticking on your taxi squad or sticking on your roster at the end of the season. And the last guy is Willie Gay Jr. in Kansas City. The Chiefs linebackers have been all over the place as far as playing time. Nobody is seeing over 50, 60% of the snaps in most weeks. The few times that Gay has got an opportunity to get on the field for a significant number of snaps, he's put up some pretty good numbers for us. Another guy that I think was drafted with the intention of making him the starter once he's had a little bit of time to develop. I didn't get a chance to look at and see what the salary or the cap situation is, or the contract situation with the 2 inside linebackers that are starting now. But I think that somehow or another they're going to find a way to fit Gay into the lineup for next year.
I like that call on Gay. Even a trade target, because I think they're going to set him up to be that seek and destroy guy he was in college. A couple of more I'll add before I'll tee one up for Matt. I still liked Tyus Bowser. He came into the league really raw. You're seeing him make plays in coverage. He's also a pass rusher. Just at the same time that Hassan Reddick finally hits with 5 sacks. Bowser is a similar kind of player with that ability to drop into coverage, ability to edge rush, and we'll see. And Uchenna Nwosu, this one's a little bit of a backdoor pickup where he's actually, I think, going to be the starting defensive end in place of Melvin Ingram next year, and he's put up some really good pass rush numbers in limited snaps. I love the guy you picked to highlight, Matt, because I remember him from the playoff game against Baltimore last year. He had to be put on the field, and you thought, uh-oh, this is going to be a weak spot for the Tennessee defense, and he was actually a point of strength. He looks like a point of strength again. Tell us about one of your favorite Dynasty stashes at linebacker.
Yeah, David Long jumped into the starting lineup in the past couple weeks for the Titans after they lost Jayon Brown, and now he's playing more snaps than Rashaan Evans, who, of course, was the first-round pick from a couple years ago. 100% playing time for David Long last week, and he profiles pretty similar to Jayon Brown, who's headed for free agency in March. In his final college season at West Virginia, David Long had 108 total tackles, 19.5 tackles for loss, 7 sacks, 10 passes defensed over his final 2 years, 35 tackles for loss, 10.5 sacks. So it's a guy who has played in coverage, can play coming forward, similar to what Jayon Brown has done for the Titans. I think that there's opportunity. If he turns into nothing from here, that's certainly possible. He's like a 4.8 40 guy, so he's not high speed, but there's something to grasp onto here and see what happens heading into next season. And then one more name I want to throw out is Zach Bond from this year's rookie class, who's done nothing in New Orleans. But, you talk about Tyus Bowser being a little raw. Zach Bond was an edge player at Wisconsin, kind of played several different positions for them, and came to college as a running back, I believe. So a guy who we know can develop into something. who might have a chance to develop into something next year for a team that's got Demario Davis close to the end of his career and hasn't gotten a whole lot from Quan Alexander after the trade.
Yeah, and what I like, you bring up Jaylen Brown. And Jaylen Brown's a good player, but kind of like Jordan Hicks, Tennessee might look at him and think, "What do we really want to pay you market value with all of your injury, especially with David Long waiting in the wings?" Always waiting in the wings here at the end of the show. Your starts and sits for Week 15. You gave us the advice at the top of the show, John. Think long, think wrong. So give us some advice that will make us not have to think when we set our lineups.
So I'm going to touch on one thing, jumping back on what Matt just mentioned. Quan Alexander, for the first time since going to the Saints, he played 100% of the snaps this past week. Didn't put up big numbers, 4 tackles, 3 assists, and a forced fumble, but he did outproduce Demario Davis, who had 3 tackles and 3 assists against the Eagles, who were not a very good matchup at this point. So too late to do anything with him this year, but I think Alexander is finally starting to show a little bit of what we expected when he went there to begin with. So some guys I want to get into my lineup this week. It's corner position, Blason Austin and Bryce Hall versus the Rams. Opposing DBs are averaging 26 tackles, 7 assists since week 9 against the Rams. Austin is 22-3 in tackle column over the last 3 starts. Hall is 22-1 over the last 4 games. The Jets secondary is a mess, and people are just throwing on them like crazy. They can't really keep anybody from catching the ball, so they're getting an awful lot of tackles. They're 8, 9, 10 yards deep. Kenny Moore versus Houston. Moore's been rock solid over the past month, including a season best of 6 tackles, 2 assists with an interception and 3 pass breakups against the Texans 2 weeks ago. I like that matchup again this week. Jeff Gladney against Chicago. Since Mitchell Trubisky returned 3 weeks ago, opponents' corners have accounted for 49 combined tackles. Gladney's 53 solos are second only to A.J. Terrell's 54 among rookie corners at this point in the season. Donovan Wilson, if he's good to go from his groin injury against San Francisco. Over the last 4 games, 6 safeties have recorded at least 7 combined tackles and assists, with 5 of those players reaching double-digit fantasy points against the 49ers. Rayshon Jenkins against the Raiders this week. Jenkins has at least 5 solo stops in 7 of the last 9 games, so the floor is pretty high, and he could have a big game if he draws coverage on Darren Waller, which is a distinct possibility. Another guy that might get a lucky matchup as far as safeties go is Malcolm Jenkins against the Chiefs. The Chiefs have been a strong matchup for safeties in general, especially those safeties that draw coverage on Travis Kelce. That matchup helped Kareem Jackson to a 10-tackle day in Week 13. I think Jenkins gets a lot of that matchup this week. He's probably their most physical of their safeties, so I expect them to try to double or put some guys on Kelce with an underneath linebacker and an over-the-top safety in coverage. Calais Campbell this week versus Jacksonville. Campbell really hasn't done much for us at all this year, but you never want to underestimate the motivation of playing a former team. We've talked about that several times this year, and it seems like every time somebody on either side of the ball gets to go up against a former team, especially somebody they were with for a long time, that they put up some pretty good numbers. Olivier Vernon was on my list. We've already talked about him. Just add a little bit more to that. The Giants, as a matchup, they've given up 13 sacks in the last 4 games, even though one of those games was against Cincinnati, who did not get to the quarterback at all. So 3 of those games they allowed 13 sacks. The Steelers pass rushers against Cincinnati. Anybody that rushes the passer for the Steelers has a good opportunity to get the sack column this week. The Bengals are the second most sacked team in the league, behind Philadelphia. So that's your defensive ends. That's either of your outside linebackers. You most definitely want to start T.J. Watt, no matter what your format is, because he's almost guaranteed to get to the quarterback at least once, and very well could have multiple sacks in this game. And the last guy at linebacker would be Cole Holcomb against Seattle. Holcomb's a guy we've talked about off and on, up to 89% of the snaps this past week. He's put up 3 solid weeks with good numbers consecutively. It's a great matchup with Seattle. Over the last 6 games, 9 linebackers have reached double-digit fantasy points against Seattle, with 5 of those linebackers putting up at least 15. A few guys that I'm going to get out of my lineup this week. It's kind of hard to set one of those starting inside linebackers with the Falcons, but Tampa Bay has not been a very good matchup at all. The last linebacker to reach 5 solo tackles against the Buccaneers was Shaq Thompson, who went 5.20 in Week 10, and that is the best production by an inside linebacker or by a linebacker in general against the Buccaneers since like Week 7. So there's not been much opportunity there. Not to mention that Ronald Jones is probably not going to play this week, so they're going to be without their hammer. Aldon Smith was a guy that I called out to start last week. If you did that, it turned out pretty good. Wasn't exactly how I expected it to happen, but the points were there at the end of the day. This week, I would definitely not put him in my lineup. He's not playing Cincinnati this week, and this is a guy that's had 1 sack since Week 3. He's a below-average matchup against San Francisco. Unless you're gambling on big play production, sit everyone in the Rams back 8 against the Jets. That means John Johnson, Jordan Fuller, Troy Reeder, the corners, pretty much anybody that's not in the front 3. It's not named Aaron Donald, more or less. Since Week 9, Jets opponents have averaged about 32 solo tackles per game as a team, with the 5-1 by Bobby Wagner last week as the best tackle numbers by an inside linebacker over that span. Fred Warner versus Dallas, we're not even sure if he's going to be healthy. The Cowboys have been a mediocre matchup. Warner's nursing that stinger, which even if he does play, is likely to affect his ability as a tackler. And we've seen guys with bad shoulders and that type of injury before, where they would normally be very aggressive and going 100%. They will back off if they can see that one of their teammates is going to make the play, just to avoid the wear and tear and the possibility of getting knocked out of the game. The bigger issue there with Warner for me, that I just kind of caught this tonight looking over numbers, is that his numbers have been way down during the entire second half of the season. He has more than 4 solo stops in 1 game since Week 6, with double-digit points in 1 game since Week 7. So even before the injury, with the matchup and the numbers that he's been putting up, there's a little bit of a question mark there.
There's no question mark that you're going to get the best IDP coverage from the guru, John Norton, Football Guys. Matt Schauf. How are you doing in the Draft Shark Invitational, Matt?
Not as well as I was early in the season.
Yeah.
4th overall.
4th overall?
Yeah.
Who's first right now?
It's Pete Overzet.
Wow, Pete. See, he has his whole shtick, but he's good. He's got chops. Mm-hmm. So I got to get him on the couch. Folks, we appreciate you supporting everything we do in the IDP world. Again, Draft Sharks, SCHAUFDS, and Matt is on a lot of excellent podcasts over there. The guru and the IDP team's work at footballguys.com. We will be with you one more week, December 23rd, Christmas Eve, for Week 16, as it'll also be the beginning of the Fantasy Super Bowl Eve. So we want to do everything we can to help you, and you certainly help us by supporting what we do. And if you like the show, go ahead and like it on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, comment on the show. We appreciate that very much also, as we appreciate your time and attention, the most precious thing you have as you're playing the real fantasy football, IDP fantasy football. Stay class.